Thank you for the invitation, and what an impressive first day. I quit that now, and I will speak about peri-urban landscapes and parks on a regional, on a national, and on a European level. On the European level, we have quite interesting papers, for example, of 2019, where the organization Europark made a position paper to the EU how peri-urban parks could be supported. And if you look to these key elements, it's all the thing what we have in the Green Deal and new environment policy in Europe. And if we look on the national level of Germany, you see this overview about peri-urban parks, green networks, and regional parks. And it is a new approach and an interesting approach for meeting landscape, nature, design, and cities. And if we look in detail to these projects, then they are from the 1990s, like Berlin on the left side, and Frankfurt, Rhine Park even from the 1980s. If I'm speaking in the following about the next landscape in Ruhr, these are peri-urban landscapes indeed. And what we've done here is to create and to use new and old infrastructures to offer and to include really authentic landscapes, to prepare service for sport and for health, to offer really new parks where there have never been parks before, and to offer infrastructures for health and for sport at the same time. And we also offer opportunities to read, to use, and to understand the urban landscape from the very beginning, and as well as during daylight, everyday life at the afternoon. And we're offering things that are well done if you share these things together. And we also created opportunity to read the landscape like this stair, to look on industrial nature. And this also includes that we have to have information for the people outside in the landscape. We are creating public places for private use, and we are including the industrial heritage, which is the origin identity for this industrial region Ruhr. We're also creating poetic moments, and we are creating offers for the people using this landscape in bigger groups as well as in smaller groups. And we're sharing our experience with our colleagues, like in this case in October 2019, when EPR from Prague was visiting us. Transformation of the Ruhr and talking about peri-urban parks in the Ruhr area is based on this long-term experience of change. We are part of Europe, part of Germany. We're located in this western part of North Rhine-Westphalia, and we are a polycentric agglomeration of 4,400 square kilometers. We are a built urban area, and you can see where this dense corridor of built cities lays. We are a network of 53 cities, 4 counties, and we count altogether 5.1 million inhabitants. The story is the story of change, and it started in the 1960s with coal and coal crisis due to overcapacities, changing technologies, missing productivity and medium-sized mining companies, and mainly changing European and world market conditions and changing energy policies up to renewable energies today. It was shared by the steel crisis again, and a complete changing of the world market that was necessary to change our economy as well. So the experience of the Ruhr is a long story of change, and this means that state government, cities, managers developed and implemented strategies, plans, instruments, and projects, big and small. And we have to have experience of 60 years of structural policy. So I just pick out some examples of impulses for change. One is from 1912, so more than 100 years ago, when Robert Schmidt asked for a national park for the industrial zone on Rhine and Ruhr, located not outside, but in the region, between the city, easily and accessible for all. I jumped to 1960s when Willy Brandt asked for the sky above the Ruhr has to be blue again, a vision that nobody could think about in those days. And it was followed by the Minister-President of North Rhine-Westphalia, Heinz Kuhn, who asked for a better public qualities, and Johannes Rau, who started with integrated approach in regional development. So just to keep that in mind as a background, in the 1990s, we had the International Building Exhibition Emscher Park, and I'm describing this shortly because, again, it was the reason and the conditions for making the Emscher Landscape Park on this context. The IBA Emscher Park was a 10 years workshop for the future of old industrial regions. And again, it was something with inter-local cooperation, including 17 cities. It had several topics like the Emscher Landscape Park, the Emscher River, the reuse of brownfields, and altogether it was seen that these qualities, these soft location qualities were a new basis for structural change and new economic development. The IBA was a small operative organization. It had a brilliant political network on all levels, and it started with a written strategy, the Memorandum Number 2. This was continued with the second memorandum in the interim time in 1996, and it had a reflecting version in 1999 at the end. So it was a process, an open public process from the first day, and it was based on very critical and very fascinating papers and visions that were laid down. After 10 years in 1999, the IBA festival, the show year happened, and this included the work that has been done in the Emscher Landscape Park and in all these other 100 projects. So 100 projects, 17 cities, 10 years, that was a laboratory with a lot of public participants in the cities, in the regions, etc., a unique opportunity to do things different and to learn from that. It was at the same time a great opera that was really professional and managed. It was a provocation. Let's do things different. It was very difficult. And it was the discovery of industrial landscape and of industrial heritage. The IBA was open for cooperation, and therefore it offered really different experience, and it was the necessary to know the sites, not to plan just for your own, but at the same time. And it was knowing the site included traveling through the sites. It was a great number of sites visits for 10 years, and it was a confrontation with the necessary to clean up contamination of industrial periods. It was an offer for new bikeways, and it was an invitation to art to join all that. And it was a challenge for the public administration and a second of unique projects that have been done in these 10 years. IBA was a network of people learning together, and it was love at the second sight, identifying the great qualities that have been involved in there. The renewal of the Emscher River was one of the big regional projects, and that meant that we have to redesign our whole sewage system because a river has been mistreated for more than 100 years as a wastewater canal. And what we had to do was to clean up all the small rivers and the main rivers and to separate wastewater from rainwater and create new rivers. This project now is nearly finished, and it had an investment for more than 5 billion euros to do and to maintain now a complete different urban landscape. Now I'm coming to the Emscher Landscape Park, the regional park system. And it is a park in the center of the region. It's 457 square kilometers today and 20 cities. It was started with a feasibility study in the beginning of the international exhibition. And we call this publication of the feasibility study ELP 1.0, the first software version. We had installed then in the 90s a planning system on 3 levels, a regional moderation, 7 intermunicipal working groups, and the design of the single projects. And this cooperation of neighbor city was really one of the strategic key to make it happen. And this means that the local administrative people, the local responsible people, really were involved in their neighborhood landscape. So working together meant that the boundaries between the cities disappeared. So the whole regional park came up to be seen. The Emscher Landscape Park had a lot of visions, what could be the future of this nature. And we started even in 1992 with an investment program to make it happen. And that was called Nature for the People. In the interim time of the International Building Exhibition in 1995 and 96, we published an interim report where the results of the first 5 years have been seen, and it was the second version of the software. And in 1999, at the end of the EBA, we published the third version of this. After the EBA in 2001, we had the question where to go with the EBA, with the Emscher Landscape Park after the EBA, and we brought all the people together who were involved, and they told us to continue. So the second step then was to talk about the economic benefit of the Emscher Landscape Park on a workshop, regional workshop on working in the park. And we had the opportunity to start a master plan, and I had the opportunity to contract 18 planning officers for rethinking, redoing the software, the strategic work, and a lot of paper, a lot of discussion, a lot of results were presented to us. And we put that together to the public in a first interim report, then in a draft of a master plan, so that everybody in all the 20 cities were involved could discuss the detail of that. And after that, in 2006, we published the Master Plan 2010, which you still can download in the internet with the shown thing. The Master Plan included a new version, a new vision for a new Emscher Valley. It showed the complete area of the new park. It showed up the new infrastructures to be created in the landscape, and more than 400 projects that have been finished. So what kind of projects these have been? These have been flagship projects like Peter Lutz on the Landscape Park, Duisburg Nord, converting a former steel site into a public park and offering unique opportunities to use and to understand industrial landscape. It included poetic projects like the Inner Harbor in Duisburg with Danny Caravan, and a lot of transformation projects where whole sites of former industry have been converted into new public parks, with reusing the old industrial infrastructures for public purposes and creating good qualities. Another example is the integrated projects of Phoenix and Dortmund, where a whole steel site has been converted into a new neighborhood. And this new neighborhood included not only vast work on contamination, but also creating a complete different surrounding and starting for new urban development as well as landscape development. And people joined this process in a very attractive way, and are using this landscape today as their new own environment and urban surroundings, as well as the water management here is completely well done. The Emscher Landscape Park includes a long list of infrastructure projects from rail to trail. So we converted industrial infrastructures to people's infrastructure for biking, for walking. And we're very interested in creating good design, good solutions for the new landscape. And works very easily that people who see what kind of design is offered to them, they understood that we want to qualify the urban landscape, that we are interested in good design and in an attractive future for this urban landscape. There are amount of working and good infrastructures today, and we're continuing with this. And we also make them working for handicapped people. So we're thinking about what are the needs that have to be done. And we're also including cultural offers on this former industrial site, as well as ecological projects in the landscape. We have a series of landmark projects using the hills of the industry, of the coal mining industry, by arts or even by structures where you can climb up and can experience the urban landscape in various ways. And people are very proud about these objects to be climbed up and to read and to understand the surrounding. The Emscher Landscape Park includes park information as well, and visitor centers who give the opportunity to understand what is going on, what is the basic for them, and what are the goals, for example, for biodiversity. We've continuously published informations about the park and also about the ongoing discussions, what could be the current perspective and the coming perspective for the regional development. We're looking ahead to 2027, where a new international garden exhibition will happen in the Ruhr. And so in the moment, these plans, these competitions are going on to find very good solutions for these new sites in the Ruhr. And again, it will not be one site, it will be several sites. So at the end, I'm coming to the green perspective of green infrastructures. We take over the ideas from the EU, and we discussed the opportunities to create green infrastructure in the Ruhr area with the EU quite successfully. And we also had a lot of opportunities to explain our ideas about green infrastructure, for example, in national level. This year, for example, is a meeting with the Chinese environmental minister in 2016, discussing examples of the green infrastructure in the Ruhr. And by doing so, we also were very pleased to be a finalist with one of our projects. The concept of green infrastructure for the Ruhr is an integrated and sustainable development, a combination of green, blue, and gray infrastructures. And it's based on these 25 years. And it's a platform for regional cooperation, for intermunicipal cooperation, and for interdisciplinary things. And in 2016, we laid out 5 layers that could be worked on: the landscape, the water in the city, a kind of green urbanism, all the things around about climate and energy efficiency. We've published that, and you can also get the information down in the internet. Today, we've changed a little bit the wording. It's called Offensive Green Infrastructure 2030, and it's continuously detailed working on the strategy. So finalize our lessons that we've learned. It's a long story, and it needs change, and this change includes solutions that really have to be tailor-made. The experience of the Emscher Landscape Park is a combination between vision and facts, between intermunicipal cooperation and creating trust, it's very important to create a kind of capacity building and leadership together with workshare, and it needs moderation and initiatives, and also it's a learning projects and projects. It's about planning and project development. It is continuously necessary to renew the software, and it needs continuity and flexibility. We need an integration and support with other things. So it's not going only with landscape and green infrastructure. If we continue with that, really should be seen and managed as infrastructure with the people. So thank you for your listening to that, and thank you for the invitation again.
Thank you very much for your lecture. That was very inspiring, and I hope that there will be some interesting questions during the discussion. Now it's time for the second lecture that will be held by Matthew Pottinger from State University of New York. He's professor there. Welcome to camp, Mr. Professor.
Okay, yes, I'm Matthew Pottinger. I teach landscape architecture at the State University of New York in Syracuse, New York. And much of what I'm going to talk about is situated there, but I'm really going to scale from North America to primarily then the Northeast of the United States, and then Central New York, Central New York State, and then Syracuse. And hopefully I'll zoom back out. I'm going to be talking, while it's focused on that area, hopefully we'll be talking about some working strategies that are transferable to other places. So I'm going to be looking at productive landscapes and the idea of eating ecologies. And we're really starting with this daily practice of eating, which is incorporating food into our bodies, really for sustaining ourselves. But it has significant impacts, extracorporeal impacts beyond our bodies, so that the food we eat is the landscape we make. But because of the scale and complexity of the landscape of food production, and food systems, we don't see this relationship. But the productive landscapes of agriculture are some of the most impactful human activities of the Anthropocene. Agriculture has radically transformed ecologies. By various estimates, agricultural production has transformed over half the global land area. This industrial model of agriculture has destroyed habitats, increased soil erosion, consumed vast amounts of water, contributes to, by some estimates, over 30% of greenhouse gases. So we need to look at this landscape. And while I'm talking about North America, I mean, these are processes in other parts of the world. I'm familiar from working on some with Henry Hansen and Jan Richter, a project in Slavinica in southern Czech Republic that has gone through collectivization and then now intensive privatization. You see there the contrast between that landscape and some of the smaller village pattern across the border in Austria. So, this is the landscapes that we're creating by what we eat. We don't see this connection. This is in the United States, northern Iowa. 95% of that land has been transformed by agriculture, and primarily monoculture. 98% is in corn and soybean. So it's a challenge. How do we start to look at this? I think we need a shift in landscape architecture and design to look at productive landscapes. We need a pretty radical shift from focusing really essentially landscapes of consumption to look at landscapes of production and their impacts. But it raises questions of, what's the role of design? What's the role of landscape architecture with these kinds of landscapes? And these larger processes of regional specialization, reduction of diversity, and the environmental impacts, and especially the social impacts. So it raises these questions. I actually just had the opportunity last week to fly across the North American continent from San Francisco back to Syracuse and got to observe this out the plane window. And this is where I'll pick up here today, is that there's these areas you can see the traces of riparian areas or little patches of forest, these leftover areas. And that's what they actually hold the key to transforming productive landscapes. And I also want to point out a kind of irony in the profession that we focus a lot on restoring habitat, protecting ecological areas, but primarily for other species. Meanwhile, and their food systems, their food chains. Meanwhile, the human food system is the most destructive of ecological habitat globally. So I think we create this dichotomy that productive landscapes are over here, out in the rural landscape, and we have consumptive landscapes in the city. Dichotomies of rural versus urban, culture versus nature, production versus consumption. And what we're going to talk about today is start to break down some of those dichotomies. One of the first things to do is to frame this idea of productive landscapes and contextualize it as part of concept of food systems, larger systems. We need to see productive landscapes through a food systems lens or framework. This idea was recognized about just a little over 20 years ago by Jerome Kaufman and Kami Patakuchi, planners at University of Wisconsin. This is about the same time I started to look at food and landscape, and it was a really marginal area of landscape architecture. And so from a food system lens, we start to see production connected to a whole network of other activities and practices and people, production, distribution, processing, marketing, consuming, and disposing and waste. And all of these sectors of the food system are embedded in landscape systems of land, water, transportation, housing, energy, and so forth. So again, the food we eat is the landscape we make, and the food system lens helps to make that connection. And any food item that we eat is embedded in these different systems. Here's the global clementine. Okay. So from a food system lens, go to the other end. Our agricultural landscapes, our productive landscapes are connected systemically to places of marketing. And this is just a diagram of the growth of retail marketing, grocery stores, at least in the United States, in square footage. Really boomed in the 1970s. And at the top is a footprint of a suburban grocery store and overlaid on top of a neighborhood where a grocery store used to be, and now it's surrounded by parking. So again, our productive landscapes, it's related to communities design and things like location of markets. And from a food system lens, we can also then understand when we look at the large scale production, monocultures, corporate consolidation, the large scale grocery stores, that our production landscapes are all geared towards that. So in that grocery store, the greens that you would buy come from primarily this particular landscape in California. 90% of the greens that Americans eat come from this landscape, the Salinas Valley, and also primarily from one corporation, Taylor Farms, which actually contracts with hundreds of and controls the production practices of hundreds of smaller producers. And essentially what they're doing is shipping millions of gallons of water out of California to other places in the form of lettuce or broccoli or celery. Okay, so what we're doing when we're eating we're eating ecologies of other places. So food system framework helps us to make these connections and to see landscapes as networked territories through food. So what do? It can be overwhelming. So I'm going to offer some strategies. One strategy is to think of a spatial and system strategy, the concept of food sheds, to respatialize food systems into regional productions and distribution systems. This idea is almost 100 years old. The first idea of food shed from the 1920s. This book called How Great Cities Are Fed. It was written in response to a railroad strike and the fear of losing food provisioning to New York City. So, and this idea was revived in the 1990s, late 1990s. And this is an example of Columbia University Urban Design Lab creating this model for regionalized food systems in North America. And this is something I've been working on here in Syracuse and Central New York. That's the CNY part of this slide. And we just recently completed a food plan for the Central New York food shed, which looks at all the different sectors of the food system, from production to distribution, markets, and consumption. And this is this landscape here. It's based also on a recent study by crop scientists that really concluded that most cities in New York State, except for New York City, could actually feed themselves with the soil conditions and the agricultural land around them. Syracuse, which is in the center there, it's estimated could feed itself with a radius of 20 miles around the city. So this is an effort to spatialize the food system. Okay. And this is our delineation of the food shed. And it works on this metaphor of watersheds. The Lake Ontario watershed is outlined there in black, but the food shed's based on driving distances, landform, soil conditions, and existing production patterns. It's also working with food shed enables us to look at and adapt food systems to particular regional ecologies that have been erased or obliterated by more global food systems. One particular aspect of the regional ecology of Central New York is we have a great resource of muck soils, which have a particular cultural history, and they're highly productive, and they produce things like spinach and lettuce and celery, which is coming from the Salinas Valley. So we can relocalize some of that production and diversify. Project that we worked on too is that regional food shed you can start to address some of the ecological environmental impacts of food systems. In our region, we have this issue of harmful algal blooms. This is a bloom in Lake Erie, one of the Great Lakes. So we've taken on a project looking at the harmful algal blooms in our watershed, our food shed in the Finger Lakes region, and modeled what are the inputs, what are the causes for that, and the pathways that nutrients, phosphorus and nitrogen, how they end up in the lakes. And then we did GIS analysis of each different lake, its proportion of agriculture, the nutrient loading, its history, the lake profile, and how it all affects the nutrient blooms, the algal blooms. And then we did we identified some hotspots and looked at how we can redesign this landscape with new agroecologies. And in particular, working with models of conservation agriculture, diversifying agriculture, going away from corn and soy to more perennial crops, and also working with productive bioswales and hedgerows and increasing biodiversity. And the idea with that was that these swales and hedgerows and woodlot edges would also be productive. They would produce food. So production system management practices, we called them, for hedgerows, interfield meadows, forest edges, wetlands. And so we get down to the individual farm scale, as well as looking at the food shed scale. Another project that I've worked on, continue to work on, is a peri-urban farm just out at the edge of Syracuse, New American Refugee Farm. Syracuse is a receiving area for New American refugees. And I won't go into this in too much detail, but we're developing a diverse production system there. But this this is a space where I've also learned from the New American refugees that our paradigms of productive landscapes are limited. When we first started this farm, the New American refugees went immediately right to the edge of the fields and started harvesting what we would call weeds, lamb's quarter, stinging nettle, pokeweed, etc., as important edible produce. And the person there holding stinging nettle, he said, in the refugee camps, we didn't have access to doctors and medicine. This was our medicine. And they foraged between the rows of crops. So this is a provocation to change the model of productive landscapes, to look at productive ecologies and the spaces in between and the spaces that are neglected. So what we've in measuring the output of this farm, these so-called weeds account for 1/3 of the productivity of the farm. And we're not obliterating the weeds, we're harvesting the weeds. Okay. So this is what I want to focus on at the end of this presentation here, and a series of projects which reversing, it's kind of figure ground inversion or reversal from this emphasis on productive spaces of fields to look at the leftover spaces, the spaces in between, the interstitial spaces, where we have kind of what you could say novel ecologies. And paired with that is this cultural practice of foraging, okay, which is basically finding food in these ecologies already and really reversing the paradigms of productive landscapes. This is a project that we're working on. I'm working on with an ecologist and also someone from food studies at Syracuse University, working as a Syracuse Urban Food Forest Project. Taking this really popular idea right now of community food forests or urban food forests, which are still on individual sites, small sites, but we're expanding this to the landscape scale. And as a corridor, really a riparian corridor in the watershed that along Onondaga Creek that comes through Syracuse, New York. And there's the watershed and there's the project area focus. So it goes from the urban edge down into the urban core. Okay. And the idea here is that this was unrecognized public space. It's actually publicly accessible, well, even though it's not developed as park, and that it's a productive ecological system that's already there, but it's not recognized as such. And the project is about connecting these ecologies and public spaces, various spaces, riparian ecologies, city parks, schools, streets, community gardens, urban farms, and vacant lots. And I mentioned foraging. It's also based on this cultural practice of foraging, which I don't know what you think of when I mention this, but it's been a very marginalized practice. It's sometimes thought of something before civilization, something that the early humans used to do but don't do anymore. But I've been part of a research network with researchers in Philadelphia, New York City, Seattle, who are documenting urban foraging and finding it to be a really widespread practice. And that these are some of the counts of the diversity of species that they're finding in urban landscapes. Okay, we're doing an extensive inventory of the edible plants in this corridor. We're over 100. Okay, and this is just the one portion of the spreadsheet, looking at how it's used, its seasonality, what parts of the plant. Okay, and I find foraging is really important cultural practice in that it crosses boundaries and it raises questions about these categories: what's public and private, wild versus domesticated, weed versus cultivated, and native versus invasive. And it also deals with emergent landscapes in motion, landscapes that are, you could say, these novel ecologies, which we need to pay more attention to as the ecologies of the Anthropocene. They're hybrid, they're emergent, they're assemblages, and they're really embedded in existing agricultural and urban landscapes. And they actually provide resilient ecosystem functions. And so it's really important to understand these, what they're all about. And what I love about foragers, people who forage, they're exploring these landscapes that have been ignored, landscapes that haven't been mapped, and histories too. This was one of my students who sort of mapped the journey of, quote, different weeds from different parts of the world to Syracuse and when they were brought over and for what purposes. And these are all edible weeds. We've looked at, who's foraging. It cuts across social, gender, economic class, from high-end chefs to people from all different culture groups. And we also are working closely with a Native American group. Syracuse is close to the Haudenosaunee Onondaga Nation. We're on their land, and they're an active presence. Professor at our college, Robin Kimmer, some of you might know her. She wrote this book called Braiding Sweetgrass. She talks about the honorable harvest. So, and they've really managed this ecology for hundreds of years. So that's also part of this project. Along with community engagement, the transect cuts through areas of Syracuse that are recognized as, quote, food deserts. Part of the project, we've employed people from the community, a woman who has this Afika Pure. She creates body care products, and she's now an avid forager, as is a woman who runs this great title, Bad Vegan Cafe. So they've been part of our community food walks to generate public engagement and finding a really diversity of purposes, reasons for doing this foraging. And the key thing then is where it happens. And we're working on this typology of different spaces, from parks, institutions, vacant lots, kind of along this transect, and then mapping this typology. And then we're organizing this by ecological habitats. We have cattail wetland, we have an upland maple forest, et cetera, and identifying all the edible species there, and then how these edible ecologies can be designed and managed, working closely with the city arborist in Syracuse. And while we're working on this distinct transect, we're also, it's a pilot project to expand the scale to that. This pattern shows a drumlins glacial pattern in Syracuse, which is also another great forageable landscape. So we're looking to expand this at the city scale and also at the rural regional scale. And finally, it brings up these issues of policy and ownership, because foraging crosses private property and blurs those boundaries. It encourages us to think about landscape as commons and food as commons, shared public resources that are managed and negotiated across different groups. And I should say the bowls on the right there is one of my favorite Korean restaurants in Syracuse. All of those vegetables in those bowls are foraged in the region, and these bowls are something that are shared in the beginning of a meal. So it's this idea of food as commons as well. And back to this image, these may seem like marginalized landscapes. They may seem like these just small interstitial spaces between the dominant production model, but it's a starting point. It's a generative starting point to change productive landscapes. And it's a way for landscape architects to start to find leverage in changing the agroecology of productive landscapes. And what I also think too, it's really critical for public health, because to eat the landscape, to be able to eat the ecology wherever you are, means it needs to be healthy. So it's a motivator for landscape restoration and creating healthy environments where people live and increasing public access and another overlay and use of public space. So I will end there, and I believe that's my time for this. And I really look forward to questions on this.
Thank you very much for the lecture, and thank you both gentlemen for joining the discussion. We have a few questions before we go to the next session. So the first question is for you, Matthew. We mentioned that yesterday Richard Weller spoke about World Park project and hotspot cities, etc. Your projects looks like they have also very huge scale, almost a global scale. I've seen United States from the plane, as you mentioned, and the scale is huge compared to Europe. Do you think that these changes, these global changes or huge scale changes are possible in one generation? Do you think that it's possible that we plan these things and we will see the results?
That's a great question, because I really enjoyed Richard Weller's talk. And in some ways, I felt like what I'm addressing is the other 85%. He was talking about 15, 17% of creating these biodiverse and biosphere protection areas. I was looking at spaces that are embedded in the everyday landscapes and agricultural landscapes and urban landscapes, which have experienced the most radical change. And I guess it's finding that there's actually things that are already there, hybrid landscapes and ecologies that we can work with. And it's working less on I guess it's working more on a aggregate level. Many multiple small scale projects, and multiple scale projects, but that's why starting with foraging, it seems so trivial, but it's where you build this connection, and it's the people who forage, like I mentioned, who are really mapping out these landscapes that have been ignored. And so that's the starting point. So I think our food system, our landscape, is made from many multiple decisions, but still shaped by policies. So I think if we can work at both levels, at the sort of the 35,000 foot level in policy, and these micro social practices, which eating is we're doing it so often during the day. So every act of eating can be a practice for changing and making landscapes. So you're just trying to make that connection.
Thank you. Next question is for Mikhail. It's almost the same one. You mentioned that the workshop was almost a decade long. You also mentioned that the network of the regional network contains a lot of cities, many cities. How is it possible to coordinate works and coordinate so many projects? Because you mentioned green infrastructure projects and infrastructure for bikes, etc., and revitalization of the river. How is it even possible to coordinate so many projects and coordinate a cooperation between so many cities?
The answer is partnership. And creating partnership means that you share knowledge, that you share information, that you follow critical advices, etc., and that you work together. So it's not a miracle, it is work. And if you think about a football team, then you have a trainer, and the trainer is therefore to support the single sportsman. And if you want to cooperate with several cities, then you create and you support the single city in its potentials, in its power, in its creative locations, etc. So our experience was it is a mid to long-term thing to cooperate, to produce things together, and to share knowledge as well as the benefits. And this means not running away with the best result. And this is not who is the best, it is what can we do together. And it is just a good human behavior, which is necessary, not so much tricky things, not so much backstage things, but doing it on the surface, doing it visually, doing it in the public. And this means all documents are available for all partners. All interim reports are available for all cities. For example, with the draft of the Emscher Landscape Park master plan, I had 105 meetings in town halls, in planning commissions, etc. And some of my experts asked me, Michael, why are you going all the time to all these meetings? And I said, if I'm not going to these 20 cities, which means 5 times per cities, then it will be not their project. So sharing solutions, sharing success, and behave like good normal human beings may be the secret of a longer time management with public agencies.
Thank you. Yes?
If I just add really briefly, what I found working with food systems, it's networks, always. And it's one thing I always have students are always doing network diagrams of these relationships. So yeah, I would add, yes, support that one.
One short question about the Ruhr. Do other German regions get inspired by your projects?
Yes. There has been a while kind of tourism even from colleagues. This has gone because most of them have been there and have visited the site, etc. But there is a continuous exchange with other integrated urban landscape projects in Germany as well as in Europe.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I'm afraid that we are out of time. So thank you very much for your answers. Thank you very much for your lecture and time. I guess that we will meet again with Matthew during the hangout. And thank you again. And now I would like to invite Martina Imramovská for the conclusion of today.
So hello once again. Not for the last time for today, but one of the last. I'm sure that we heard very inspirational words. I think we were given the tools how to communicate not only our problems, but also our desires and our wishes of what we want our landscape architecture to be. And for that, I'm very thankful. And I would like to thank all the speakers that they shared their knowledge, their experiences, that they were willing to participate to this conference, because I can tell you from my own experience, it was very important for us. So thank you once again. On the other hand, I would also like to thank all of our partners that helped this conference to happen. And it is, of course, City of Prague, then it's Mr. Til Rewald, Mrs. Jana Pišková, Vladimír Sita, the Next Studio with Wojciech Lekeš, Landscape Festival, Czech Society for Landscape Architecture, Czech Association for Landscape Architecture, International Federation of Landscape Architects, Czech Chamber of Architects, Faculty of Architecture of Czech Technical University in Prague, and then all the people from the preparation team, the colleagues that we could discuss this conference with and that helped us make it happen. So thank you once again. One big thank you goes to you. I would also like to mention once again and invite you all to our hangout session and our workshops. As we said a couple times, workshops are now open, so if you didn't register, you don't have to and you can just join us. We'll be very happy to have you there. And you can also hang out with some of our speakers and maybe present the questions that we didn't have time to present earlier. I would like to thank you, my colleague Jirka, for amazing running of this conference, the whole team, and I hope that we will meet in person in 2 years and follow us in the meantime. There will be other smaller seminars, presentations, and smaller events going on regarding not only but also landscape architecture. So stay tuned, stay with us, and I hope to see you all soon in person. And thank you once again.